Sometimes we can have emotional feelings of emptiness. And it's kind of similar to that, but it's that act of feeling left or feeling forsaken or empty. It's the chief wound in everyone. We'll talk a little more about that. This brings on a lot of shame, which comes from the fall and abandonment because of sin. This is the basis for many strongholds and depressions. Okay, so as we're talking about this, there's going to be strongholds, different ways that there's demonic oppression, things like that. One of the reasons I wanted to talk about abandonment first is because the basis of almost every stronghold, you can find this ugly guy rearing his head. And why do I say ugly guy? Because it's not just a feeling sometimes. And we're going to talk about these first few things we're talking about is just laying a basis for abandonment. It can be a feeling of abandonment. It can be an act of abandonment. That doesn't mean there's always a spirit tied to it. We're going to talk about deeper what a spirit tied to it looks like. Because there is a difference. If I'm just abandoned once or twice, or I felt left once or twice, I'm not going to have maybe a spirit of abandonment being the main oppressor in my life. It could be the spirit of shame being a main oppressor in my life. So I kind of just wanted to talk about that. So what are the facts about abandonment? We talked about it being the first wound. What does that really mean? Well, when a baby is born, I don't want to have to be the one to tell you the dynamics of that, but what truly happens is that baby comes out. Have you ever seen a video of a baby coming out and all of a sudden it's going, I'm so glad to be in the world? No, right? That baby comes out, and what's the first reaction usually to that baby? Wah! Why? Because that baby was inside of mom's womb. It was in the placenta. It was feeling so nice and cozy in there. Even if it did have trauma or prenatal woundings, it still felt more cozy than hitting that cold air, hitting the oxygen that they haven't experienced. They didn't even have to do anything, right? Their mom's umbilical cord was attached to them. They got fed whatever that mom ate. They got to listen to whatever mom's music was. Anything that mom did, they got. But when they come out of that womb and that umbilical cord is cut, it's like an immediate reaction for most babies to cry. Because why? This is something new. This is something exciting and something God intended for goodness. But when sin came into the world, it caused it to be a feeling of abandonment. So it's the first wound. It's the first feeling of feeling like a non-being. In restoring the foundations in the stuff that Brett and Hannah and I are trained in, by the way, this is Brett and that's Hannah, if you didn't know, is restoring the foundations. Those 3-hour ministry sessions are called issue-focused ministry sessions. And in those sessions, what we do is we pray, the minister prays and asks the Lord, there's 2 ministers in with you at all times. They pray and ask the Lord what these open doors may be. Okay, and an open door just means it's a demonic oppression. It's been an open door at some point in your life for demonic oppression to either enter in generationally or to enter in because of maybe something that we've had committed against us or something that we've committed a sin against God. It can be any of those 3 things. It doesn't have to be all 3. It can be one of the 3. But when that happens, that's what we consider an open door. In open doors, we consider there's a primary open door, like abandonment is a primary open door. Then there is associated open doors under that primary open door. And you can usually explain to someone how they're feeling or what they may be struggling with, because maybe under abandonment, we'll talk about that in a minute because I have a list up here. But the reason I'm explaining that to you is because there's 4 points within that ministry session. The first one is generational sins. We cast off those generational sins and curses of those 2 to 3 open doors that we do in that session. And then also the person has a chance to think about any ungodly beliefs that they have. Ungodly belief is anything that we believe it by acting it out against God's character, nature, or word. And then what the Lord does is he steps in and helps them form a godly belief to replace that ungodly belief. In the godly belief, they may repeat it to themselves for 30 days in the mirror. Why? Because you want to look in the mirror to really think about what God's doing inside of you. And then the third part of that session is what we call a soul spirit hurt. And in that soul spirit hurt, what happens is we ask the Holy Spirit to take you back to a place. It's nothing you think up, it's where the Holy Spirit leads you. And it's really cool because most of the time I've seen people go back to a memory they forgot they even had. And so the Holy Spirit just takes them right back into that memory. They have the hurt revealed. If it's abandonment, they may feel abandoned, alone, rejected, whatever it may be. And then Jesus steps into there to show them that he's been there the whole time. He heals that hurt, and now they can think about and process that memory without all the trauma. If you know the way our brains work, I could tell you the technical part of that, but I'll do that in some of the other sessions. It's really cool because our amygdala, which is where our memory is stored, is also really close to our emotions in our brain, and that's one of the reasons we have all this trauma. But when you do that, the soul spirit hurt works like that. Well, the fourth part of these sessions is that we have demonic oppression. And that's where the enemy comes in, and he may not have full control of your life, but he presses on you and gives you this pressure to make you want to sin in certain ways because of generational curses, or, like I said, doors that have been opened because of sins against you or other things that you've sinned against God. The reason I'm telling you this is because that right there, the first feeling of feeling like a non-being, it's numbness. And the reason why I want you to think about that is because I actually have a story that I'm going to share. But I have a friend who went through one of these sessions, and the soul spirit hurt session, she remembers laying in the crib, and her parents, she was like maybe even 1 year old. I don't even know if she was one. I think she was like really young. And she was laying in the crib, and she just remembers crying and crying and crying. And she couldn't get her parents to pay attention to her because they were fighting over the crib. And as they were fighting over the crib, she remembers going back into that whole soul spirit hurt. And one of the things she said is, I feel like, have you ever seen one of those water babies that they give to kids? It's just a baby that has silicone on the outside, so it feels kind of like our skin, but it's full of water so that it moves like a baby, but yet it doesn't have bones or anything in it, so it's still really malleable. Well, water baby's kind of creepy because when you touch one, it moves with the movement of the water, kind of like a real person, but at the same time, it's dead. It's numb, right? That water baby has no feeling. Well, this person remembers going back into that crib and being like a water baby, feeling like they had no life in them, that they couldn't be touched, and when they were touched, they didn't feel it. Jesus stepped into that memory, and he just picked them up, and he just held them, and Father God was there and holding this person, and it brought so much healing, even just from 6 months to 1 year old. And so that's what abandonment feels like. It makes us feel numb, like we're not a being, like I should have no emotion or no feeling. I don't know if you've ever heard of people cutting. It was a really popular thing for teenagers a while back. One of the reasons cutting is so popular is because what happens is they feel so numb that eventually they're like, okay, on the outside I'm numb, but I need my emotional pain, my physical pain to match my emotional pain. So I'll just cut myself so that I can feel the same kind of feeling on the outside as I feel on the inside, because it feels that devastating to the person. It's actually something that I used to struggle with when I was in high school. Only for 2 years did I struggle with it, but the Lord is so good. He actually even healed my scar that had an M on my forearm here. So God is so good to heal a lot of those things. It's the first wound in infant experiences. We've already talked about that. It's like shattering. We feel forsaken, deserted, or threatened. We feel like everyone is going to abandon us. When this is like happened over time, you just begin to feel so lonely. Sometimes being left doesn't feel like being left. Okay, so in this 3-hour paperwork, we have it what we call a personal questionnaire. And there's a question on there that likes to trick us. And the question says basically, rate how you feel your father loves you from 1 to 10. Rate how you feel your mother loves you from 1 to 10. Do you know how many people come into IFMs and they'll rate it at a 10? But then it'll say, use 3 words to describe your mom and 3 words to describe your dad. Well, they rated dad and mom, they loved them, that they showed them unconditional love and were there for them, as a 10. But then they described mom as cold and distant and hard. Do you see any 10s of love in those 3 descriptions? So sometimes the enemy likes to trick us into thinking, well, dad was there. The only difference was is he had to work a lot on the truck. Or maybe dad was there, but these things happened and it made it feel like he wasn't really there. Because abandonment can be physical, it can be emotional, or it can sometimes be those needs that we never express out loud as a little boy or a little girl because we don't know how to. And so being left doesn't always look like being left. But if you feel left in your heart and your soul, then there is a wound there somehow of abandonment. It doesn't mean that that person was trying to hurt you. We have so many people who come in with the most loving parents and they have the most loving spouse, but they still feel so abandoned by that spouse and by those parents that it's not even funny because they just can't stop crying over it. Why? It doesn't mean that the people have done an injustice to you. It means that you have felt you've received an injustice because it feels like it's a thing that keeps happening. So it accumulates over the span of our life. What does that mean? It doesn't mean that it just is one thing that happens. You know, Luke chapter 4 says that Jesus came to heal the bruised, the brokenhearted, right? So with abandonment comes bruises in our spirit and our soul, and those are harder to see. If someone physically abuses me, you can see the bruises on the outside, but if you just walk in here today, let's just say Peter had a really bad day and he walks in here, I'm not going to be able to know that he has a bruise on his soul. But you know what? I can see, oh, maybe he looks sad today. Maybe something's going on, but I can see that bruise. Well, how does a bruise work? It just happens over time. If I sit here and I just tap my hand for just like this right here while we're teaching, I'm probably not going to get a bruise. And I'm obviously not tapping it very hard because you can't even hear it through the mic. But if I was tapping it just that lightly and I continued to do that for 72 hours without a break, did you know after 72 hours, even though that's not a blunt force trauma, it would feel that way because there would be a bruise under the skin? That's exactly what Satan likes to do with abandonment. He takes one small tap, maybe dad moved far away after the divorce, maybe mom left you, whatever it may be. That may be a big one or it may be a little one. And then he takes these little T's, trauma that's little T's of abandonment, and he just, oh man, that friend ignored you at the lunch today. Well, there's another tap that just keeps going. Maybe it just seems to be that you're ignored by everyone you talk to. Why? Every time do I get in a conversation, it feels like everyone is talking over me. Or maybe it's just that every time you get into an argument with your spouse, you're like, why did they not hear anything I said? Why could they not remember anything that I just told them? Or maybe it's just even those things where you begin to do something and you send somebody to get like a gift for you, or like maybe somebody went to get a gift for you and they come and bring that gift back, but it's not exactly what you like. Now that doesn't sound like abandonment because of rejection and other things are in that though. It begins to feel like nobody loves me, nobody sees me. I have been emotionally abandoned. I've been abandoned in being seen. And if being seen wasn't important, if being accepted wasn't important, then why would God even address himself in the Old Testament with Jacob and Leah, with Jacob, Leah, and Rachel, or even Sarah and Abraham as El Roy, the God who sees, if it wasn't important? And so abandonment makes us feel, though, that those small wounds are just something that's happened to us over time and it doesn't really affect us, and that we should just keep going with life and just. There's this phrase in the South, and it may not be said here, but oftentimes in my small town, all the women and the men had to be really strong. And so I've heard this more than ever. Oh, that hurt your feelings? Suck it up, buttercup. And it's like, I'm tired of sucking it up, buttercup. I'm ready to deal with this stuff that's on the surface. And that's what abandonment does. That's what some of these things do. And it's not just abandonment. Neglect, unworthiness, rejection, they all feel that way. Sometimes they can feel so small and you just feel like your inner conscience goes, all right, just suck it up today, Marissa. Just keep going. Just keep pressing through. But sometimes we don't have to press through if we can break it. And that's the thing I tell people every day, because I think that the most important thing is that these things that we're learning about in these classes, they're things that can be broken off of you. They're things that you don't have to walk through life going, hey, this is my struggle. This has always been my struggle. Because that's what I did. I walked through 30 years of, well, it wasn't 30 years of Christianity, but 15 years of Christianity going, guess I'll just suck it up today and try not to sin in this area. And then when I found these, I was like, man, I guess I'm going to pray about this and get this stronghold broken and plead the blood over me and get some healing and get some life in me and blessings. But it contains all of our losses, disconnections, and disappointments. So sometimes we can think of abandonment as loss, but it's not just loss, it contains our disappointments. It also contains our disconnections. The examples I really like that they give, but an early death of a parent. Did a parent intend to abandon you? Like if a parent got taken in a car accident, they didn't intentionally abandon you, but do you feel abandoned? Yeah, especially if it happened at a young age. If, maybe a parent did something to cause something that they put themselves in a bad situation and then they passed away. Did they still do that on purpose? No. I don't know a single one of you who would go, all right, I'm going to my death today, unless it's suicide. And you wouldn't do that. Why? Because, like Pastor Mike Hutchins says when he was here, he said suicide is a spirit. People don't just naturally think that up. But what happens is abandonment feels very much like that parent abandoned you, even though they may not have done it on purpose. So it's just a cumulative piece of what else he could lay on top of you. A teenage breakup. I don't know if you've ever heard this, but when I was little, I'd always get the classic case. I'd come home and, Mom, that guy really doesn't like me today, and my hair was so awful, and I'm so embarrassed because I have a story with that. One time I was sitting on the stage and I was really liked the guy across from me. He was the pastor's son. This was after I was a Christian. And I was in either middle school, I was in high school. And the stage was backed up like right here, but the table that the youth sat on was on top of the stage. And I was with my back to the edge of the stage. And I went like this and drank a drink of Mountain Dew. And the guy I liked decided to say something funny at the very exact moment I took a drink of Mountain Dew, and I pushed myself backwards. Not only did my chair begin to flip, but Mountain Dew came out of my nose like this into the air, all over me. And I remember telling my mom how embarrassed I was, and she didn't say anything negative to me, but I just remember people being like, oh, it's not that bad. Everybody has an embarrassing moment. Everybody has a thing. But with teenage breakups, one of the things we say is, it's just puppy love, right? Have you ever heard that? It's just puppy love. It doesn't affect them. But when a little girl or a little boy continues to be rejected, even though it is puppy love, it's foundational love to them, because that's where they begin to make those connections with either the opposite sex or with friends or whoever it may be. And so it's so vital to them that cumulatively it may be a bunch of T's, but it can sometimes replace even a big T in our life, where somebody does really reject us in marriage or we get divorced or things like that, right? So those can work the same way. Being shown up by a sibling. I don't know if you have siblings. I know some of us do and some of us don't, but I have a brother. He's 9 years younger than me, and he could show me up in anything. I'm pretty sure he made a 35 on his ACT without studying, and I'm pretty sure he was drunk the night before and all these other things. I took the ACT and I actually tried my best and made a 19. And I just remember my mom being like, "Oh, you're so smart." And I'm like, what am I, a chop suey? I know I went to college at least. But sometimes when we're shown up by a sibling, it can just be the simplest thing that begins to do that. I don't know if you've ever seen the movie Cheaper by the Dozen. I've seen the Steve Martin version, but there's like 12 kids, right? Cheaper by the dozen. And in those 12 kids, there's this one little boy in there who's my favorite. And he's the kid who's like, I think he's 5 or 6 in the movie, and he's swinging by the rafters, and everything he does, it's always super dramatic and always super loud. And what happens with that is that kid is really just feeling abandoned. He's feeling like his siblings are showing him up. So the only way I'm going to get attention from mom or dad and not feel abandoned is I'm going to be the one to cause the ruckus and go crazy. And I'm going to scream and I'm going to rage and I'm going to be loud so that I can get attention. Why? Because he's been shown up by all of his siblings. He begins to feel abandoned. Not enough likes on social media. This one's interesting to me because I know in some of the generations who weren't raised around social media, because I'm kind of like split in between. Facebook didn't even start until I think I was a senior in college. So for me, I wasn't raised on it when I was younger. I mean, we had dial up, and to play a game, Oregon Trail, it took 5 years to even just dial it up. So I was a part of partial technology, but I'm also a part of like a life of huge technology because now everything we do, I mean, I have a MacBook and an iPad and an iPhone, and I'm pretty much connected to the outside world at all times. Sometimes I take a break from that. But the reason why I say that is because they have proven that the same way you feel is if someone walked up to you and told you, I hate you, is the same way a person who is raised in Generation Z, who has been used to social media being how they're liked and how they're friended, that if they don't go viral or they get dislikes or a mad face or something like that on their, well, they don't even really use Facebook anymore, but on Instagram, they get comments or hate stuff on Snapchat or things like that, that it works the same way that we as adults feel when we have had somebody come up to us and be like, oh, Carol, I hate you. I don't want to be friends with you. I don't hate you, Carol. I do love you. But if somebody were to say that to her, that's not going to feel very good. That's the same way that Generation Z feels about Facebook likes, Instagram likes, and going viral on YouTube and all these other social media platforms. So they can feel abandoned in this world so easily. We become more expectant and susceptible to abandonment wounds as an adult. We're going to talk about that later, but basically, I just expect abandonment after I've been abandoned so long. So I might not make friends as easily. I might keep myself at a distance a little more easily if I've experienced abandonment wounds. Abandonment wounds is stored in the limbic brain. And what happens is when we're abandoned, there's this twinge nerve, raw nerve twinge. We fail to receive recognition at work. A friend forgets to invite you to an outing, and a special date never calls you back, or you're simply ignored by someone. All of those things, they go through our limbic system. Basically, our hearts start to race, stress hormones rage through our body, and fears erupt. One of the things they talk about victims of neglect in childhood, like a childhood neglect victim or somebody who was abandoned a lot in childhood, they have this new thing in a lot of places. I know in Tennessee and Alabama, I don't know if they have it in Delaware, but it's called ACEs test. And it's a test to take to figure out your traumatic experiences in life. There are 10 questions, and the highest level is a 10. The lowest level is a 1, but if you get anything that's 5 or above, they say that you've had traumatic life experiences. Pretty sure like I scored like an 8 or a 9 on the test. But when that happens is a kid experiences those few traumatic woundings, these stress hormones rage through their body and they have all this fear. But through that, what I was saying, I forgot what I was saying about that test, but what I was saying about that test is what they've said is people who rate a 5 and above, they have cortisol levels and stuff through their brain that is just outrageous counts of chemicals that are off balance, either in their hormones or in the way they think or the way they handle stress. And their bodies even began to show that. Like some kids even express they have more body odor because they've had traumatic experiences. And not only do they have more body odor, but sometimes what can happen is they become the person who's overweight because the chemicals are so off balance, their body doesn't know how to handle those stress. That's exactly what abandonment does to us. It's those same ways. It just is an overabundance of those things. So it can make the strongest of us feel dependent on other people, right? So there's two ways to handle abandonment. We'll talk about those in just a second. But there is this stronghold that comes out of abandonment. And I do want to talk a little more about this. Eventually, we'll have a class on it. But Restoring the Foundations has this impeccably awesome teaching called Shame, Fear, Control Stronghold. And it's what they call a mega stronghold. And in that stronghold, oh my goodness, I found myself in so many pieces of it. But abandonment is one of the core roots of that stronghold. So abandonment causes shame. What is shame? Shame is that feeling, instead of going, oh man, I really messed up today and I made a mistake, we begin to go, I made 20 mistakes today. That must mean I am a mistake. And because I am a mistake, that means I'm hopeless and helpless and God can't do anything about my situation. It's oftentimes found in that person. Have you ever heard somebody say, I know God can heal me, and I know He heals everyone else, but He doesn't seem to want to heal me? There might be a little shame there. And everything I'm saying, I'm just telling you from experience. I'm not just saying it because I don't want you to feel fingers pointed at you. But the truth is that's what it is. It's just, it covers us. It's this false sense of covering by hiding so that no one else abandons us. Shame is that thing that keeps family secrets for years when there's been a whole generational line of sexual perversion or sexual abuse in the family. Shame keeps it hidden because shame secretly, as a spirit, whispers to you, if you tell somebody that, you're going to be punished. If you tell somebody that, you're going to be different. And because you're different, no one's going to ever love you. And that voice is not God's voice. It's also expressed in condemnation. And Romans 8:1 says there is no condemnation in Christ Jesus our Lord. And that is, I'm so thankful for that, because I had a voice of condemnation so deep in my head before. I was like, okay, I got to get rid of this because somehow I can't live my life, and now I can live free. Now, sometimes there is condemnation that comes back in. So hear me. I'm not saying I'm sinless or that those things don't happen, but it's not pressing down on me so much that when I walk into this room, I'm like, hey, Miss Joanne, how you doing? Miss Joanne's probably like, why are you looking at your feet? Do I have something wrong with my feet? But all the while, I'm looking down because I don't want to connect, because I'm ashamed of connecting. But abandonment causes that type of shame. Abandonment causes fear. We just talked about that, right? When that stuff courses through our body, these fears erupt. Well, what is fear? I'm not going to follow 100% to the PowerPoint, but fear is something that tends to incubate, but it's irrational. What do I mean by incubate? When I think about the word incubate, I think about those nasty petri dishes. I don't know if you ever had to do this, but in high school, we were doing this thing where they said, okay, we want to prove to you how many germs are on your hands when you don't wash your hands after you go to the restroom. So we all in science class with this one really weird teacher that I have, Lord forgive me, it's not a judgment, but thank the Lord she is really cool now. But she was like into this science stuff, and she was so excited about us learning what incubation was. So she took this petri dish and we all had to go use the restroom and not wash our hands. First of all, that takes a lot for a person to do that if you're a cleanly person. And then you stick your fingers in the petri dish and then you could go back and wash your hands. Well, then they took the petri dish and they put the lid on it, and then they put it in this thing for just 3 days. Well, I had this class every other day. So just on the second day, we came back to look at our petri dishes. There was not a single petri dish that didn't have green and yellow stuff all over it. And I remember going, that is just nasty. If we could view fear that way, we might actually get over it. Why? Because what happens is fear works like this. Oh, Miss Joanne didn't really say hi to me this morning, and she sent me a text, but I didn't get it. Did she really send me that text? Oh, and then the fear starts to go, oh, Hannah gave me a weird look just a minute ago, and then Carol just looks like she's ready to go to sleep. And all these things begin to accumulate, and it's so irrational. Because do those three people love me? I hope so, because I love them. But they do, and they're nice to me, and they're smiling at me. But the thing is it becomes so irrational that I begin to walk into a room and go, I don't want anybody to talk to me. If anybody talks to me, they may think that they hate me, and I may be wearing the worst outfit today, and because I'm wearing this outfit, that might trigger them with this and that, and oh my goodness, and oh, my hair's in the wrong place, and somebody saw that, and they think I look awful, and this is going on, and this is going on, and what if I stutter when I get up there and teach, and if I don't stutter, and oh my goodness, they're not even going to hear the word of the Lord, and then I'm going to do God injustice. Do you hear how crazy I sound? I'm actually out of breath. That's why I had to stop. But that's what happens with fear. It goes crazy and it incubates, and it just, in darkness, in shame, fear incubates even more, and it almost doubles the incubation. Abandonment causes fear because we're afraid of being abandoned in future relationships, in future churches, in future relationship with God, and the things that we do with the Holy Spirit, and the things that we do with Jesus. We get afraid of all those things. So abandonment, rejection, neglect, it creates a nagging feeling of conflict that closure remains. So what does that mean? Because it sounds kind of confusing. Closure. Have you ever met that person that you talk to, and every time you talk to them, you just go, I just feel more confused. I feel like I need closure. So then you go back and you try to talk to that person, and you still feel more confused and you need closure? It may be because they feel so abandoned, they don't know how to have closure themselves. So what's happening is they're all over the place. And I'm not talking about just somebody who doesn't finish their sentences, because that is part of it, but it's more so like, okay, I'll give you an example. And this used to be me. And so, Hannah, I'm sorry, I'm going to use you, but I'm the one who's getting the dirt on them in this example. But I remember when I first became friends with Hannah, I had not had a lot of healthy friendships at this point in college. And so the first time I texted her after we hung out, I remember thinking, because Brett always texted me back, I didn't have to worry about that. But when I first met Hannah, I'm in college, I didn't have a lot of friends that were close to me, because when I went to college, they went wild because they didn't have their wild stage. So I had met Hannah, and I had texted her after we hung out, and I was like, hey, we should hang out more. Crickets. Nothing, right? So then that's whenever you get the text, hey, did I say something wrong? Do you even want to be friends with me? And then she's like, of course I want to be friends with you. You didn't say anything wrong. But then it's like I go nuts because of my fear. And then it's like, oh, I think you don't even want to be friends with me. We should just cut off our friendship. We should never talk again. We've been hanging out in a group one time. Like, what's wrong with you? You're crazy. But that's why. Because it's that always incomplete feeling. If you know someone who continually texts you because they feel like the conversation is not complete, but they can't receive it when you say, I love you, we're okay, they've probably been abandoned at some point in their life or have that feeling cumulatively. And so that's what that means. These things cause us to be unjustly dismissed, but we long for vindication. Have you ever met that person that goes, if I could just go through one conversation and not be ignored, and if that person, you know what, I just wish she would walk out of here and trip. I mean, nobody's tripping her. I'm not doing anything wrong, right? Nobody's tripping her, but I just wish she'd have a little streak of bad luck sometimes. If you catch yourself thinking feelings like that, you might have been abandoned in whatever situation that is, maybe by a spouse, maybe by your parents, maybe by friendships, maybe by a church. There's no telling. You may even feel that way by God, even though God does not forsake us or abandon us. That's in Scripture. It doesn't mean that we can't feel that way at times, right? But that vindication is what God put inside of us as Christians, right? If you have a mercy gift, I don't know how many of you in here know your spiritual gifts, but if you have a spiritual gift of mercy, this thing wreaks havoc on you almost more than it does anybody else. Here's why. Your sense of justice is different than a person who doesn't have mercy sense of justice. A person who has a strong sense of justice outside of the mercy gift, their justice looks like this. Miss Carol just killed a person. Guess what? Miss Carol should either go to jail or get killed, right? That's a person who just has a straight sense of justice. Somebody with a mercy gift says, well, because I'm a sinner and Miss Carol's a sinner, and because of Christ, she's been redeemed, then because of that, she really needs redemption, and she needs a chance for the Lord to show her who she really is, and all of these things. So all while they're protecting everybody else and have justice for everybody else, there's also this deep sense of injustice that's been done to their heart because no one else is treating them the same way. And so abandonment really emotionally weighs on people with the mercy gift or empathy as a gift. Just keep that in mind. And also, it's not that men are less empathetic, but a lot of men are very empathetic. They just express it in a different way. But for women, in that mercy, if you have the gift of mercy and empathy as a woman, a lot of times this seems like that irrational wife that maybe you men have married, or maybe you've dated somebody like that. But if she feels irrational And maybe she's not a Christian, but the truth is, if she has a mercy and an empathy gift together, she's the person who feels like she almost goes mentally crazy because she doesn't feel loved. And she feels that sense of justice needs to be carried out. But she doesn't know how to explain it in the way that you'll understand it. But that's the basis of it right there with the abandonment. We are left alone to figure out the broken pieces. But when we have grief and want the person who hurt us to come back and take it back. So I think out of all the people I've ever felt abandoned by, there may be 5 out of the 100 that have ever come back. So what do you do about that? If that's what we really desire when we've been abandoned is for the person who left us to come back. What about that parent that passed away and died because they didn't intend to do that? They weren't trying to hurt you, but they're not going to come back and vindicate your hurt. Well, let's just say both of your parents died in a car wreck and then you got put in foster care and you get bounced around from foster care to foster care to foster care. You definitely don't feel like those foster care parents are going to come back and vindicate you, and you don't feel like your parents can come back and vindicate you. So what do you do about that? What we have to do is we have to work through the grief process with an acceptance of that without actually having the person come back. But this is the coolest thing about being a Christian. There's no other religion that claims that their God is omniscient and omnipresent, meaning that he can be all places at once, but he's not bound to time. So he can basically go back in our past, heal those past wounds in our current situation, because guess what? He's not bound to time. I may be, but he is not. And so that's the most beautiful thing about this. I don't want you to start feeling hopeless, because some of this can make us start to feel hopeless, but I promise there's healing in the end. And then what happens is abandonment causes control. I know we have no control freaks in here, right? I'm probably number one. But control looks like this. Being left causes me to want to control the outcome. So if you're going to leave me, guess what? I'm just going to be mean to you and not be friends with you and treat you like junk, because if I do that, then you can abandon me before I abandon you, or I can abandon you before you abandon me. It's complicated, right? But we as humans have a complicated brain, and we receive a lot of these complicated processes. It may not look like that. We might control by being passive, receiving bad things that no one will leave, or feeling unlovable or unworthy for him to discard me like that. You want to know one of the number one reasons that people stay in relationships of domestic violence, physical, sexual, or emotional abuse? Abandonment wounds. They feel so abandoned, probably as a child, from something that they've experienced, that they feel like what's being done to them is actually their fault, and therefore I can't abandon ship because no one will ever love me. And unworthiness comes into that, right? Because I'm not worthy to receive love. I will receive any kind of love given to me, even though it's not really love, but it feels like love. That was my biggest sin, by the way, is doing anything to be loved. I could be funny if you wanted me to. I could be mean if you wanted me to. I could be hilarious. I could do all kinds of sexual things, all just if you made me feel loved, because I was so abandoned as a child. Abandonment is like other types of bereavement, but its grief is complicated by rejection and betrayal. Grief from a death means there's a time to move on. Abandonment isn't that simple. Like if someone passes away, even though I love them so dearly, I don't have to experience them passing away every day in the same way that I did that one time they passed away. But if someone, a family member, friends, maybe multiple friends, begin to continue to reject me and abandon me, I have to go through that grief every single moment. And when I do that, my body is obviously doing those things that we talked about where the fears erupt and all these things go crazy. Can you imagine how that feels? So that's kind of some of the different things with abandonment. I'm going to kind of skip through this. There's 5 stages that RTF teaches of abandonment. I'm going to go through these quick because they're like stages of grief. With grief, you usually in denial, then you get angry, and then after you get angry, you have acceptance stage, and then you kind of start to process that, and there are 2 other stages with that. With abandonment, it's different, but it's similar to grief. There's a shattering. We have that severed love connection, whatever it is that's breaking in our disappointment, disconnection. We have the shattering. Our hearts are broken. We've been abandoned. Then we have withdrawal. So then I'm just going to withdraw, painful withdrawal of love lost. So I don't want to love again so easily because that person's going to hurt me again, or somebody else is going to hurt me like they did. Then we internalize. And when we internalize, we're trying to make sense of that wound, whether it's neglect, abandonment, rejection, or unworthiness. We're trying to make sense of that. And we can't always make sense of it. So what begins to happen is when we internalize, we go, I bet it's what I did to them. I bet it's all my fault. When we begin to blame ourselves, we move on to the fourth stage, rage. I taught school for a while. You know who my favorite kids were? Kids who threw stuff in the classroom. Why? Because I knew immediately if he's throwing a fit, throwing something in the classroom, he's angry, he's raging at me, he's spitting in my face, he has an abandonment wound, and all it takes is for me to love him. Settle him down, of course. I'm not going to let him pull my hair out, spit on me, or do all those things. But I usually can sit down and say, hey, such and such, what happened today? One of the experiences I had with a kid who was like this, he had been through all these stages, but he was just constantly raging. He was actually in kindergarten, and he went to one of the inner city schools, and I was an administrator at the time. So anytime a kid got in trouble, they would send those kids to me to discipline them. Well, my favorite thing is this is a Christian private school, even though it was in the inner city and functioned like a regular inner city school because everybody paid for these kids to come. He came in one time, and they said, I'm going to name him something. And I've always called him Little Bobby, but that's not his real name. So I'm not talking about Bobby in the sound booth back there, but his name was something different, but I've always called him Little Bobby. And Little Bobby, he comes in and he is just raging. He's throwing things at the kindergarten teacher. They've tried to sit down. He's breaking crayons. I mean, he has done just everything he can these past 2 or 3 days. Well, one of the things we started noticing is that mom and dad were bringing him later to school. And his mom and dad were bringing him later to school is when he started raging. And he just kind of continually did this for a few months. And then one day, we're all out in after school care because I was over that as well. And one of the teachers was talking to him and found out he'd had curdled milk for breakfast for the last 3 or 4 mornings. So he was neglected in a lot of ways, right? They didn't have the right kind of food. He was hungry for lunch. His parents didn't pack his lunch, and then the lunch that they had at school, he was either didn't like it or was allergic to it, whatever it may be. Because a lot of kids who have experience with abandonment and stuff, they're the kids who have sensory issues. They're the ones who sometimes have to have the earmuffs because all the noise might remind them of something that caused them to be abandoned or trauma when they were younger. Or they're the kids who feel like they're going to throw up when they go into a room because of the anxiety, and they're just like always trying to call home and be sick and get mom to come get me. Or those are the kids who are raging, or just those things like that. And so what happened with a lot of those kids is the raging ones, we could sit down and find where those abandonment or neglect wounds or those unworthiness wounds were, and you could just see the whole family healed. Little Bobby, the coolest thing about it is he had an older sister who stayed in after school care, and we ended up talking to the mom and the dad. And the dad was a generic rapper who wasn't a Christian rapper. The whole family got saved, and it was really cool. Dad became a Christian rapper under a crazy random name, and like the whole family got saved, and it was really cool to see, all because they all felt abandoned. So when you address one of the kids' wounds, you can address usually the whole family wound of abandonment. This is something that is usually generational, by the way. It's so deep that most often than not, it's generational curse. But anyway, normal abandonment stages, there's a lifting. So I'm abandoned. Maybe somebody forgets about my birthday. Or one time my mom, the day after my birthday, called and wished me happy birthday. I can go through the normal stages of abandonment or rejection with this, right? And it lifts and I'm fine. I love my mom again. My mom loves me. Everything moves on. What happens when someone gets stuck in this stage is we open up ourselves to opportunities for open doors of this spirit of abandonment. So, the spirit of abandonment. I know, excuse my cheesy little ghost, but I was like, how can I represent a spirit without being creepy? But so the spirit of abandonment, that's the main open door. So that was what we would be called the primary open door. But if you look at this list and you see these little things underneath it, like abdication, what does that mean? That means I don't want to have anybody be my parent because I can do it all on my own because everyone's hurt me and I don't need you, right? As a parent. Blocked intimacy. I just feel like I don't know how to be intimate with anybody. Now, what does that really mean? I'm not talking about just sexual intimacy. I'm talking about like, I don't know how to really sit down and have a conversation with you and you have a conversation with me and me give you stuff and you give me stuff in our relationship and not know how that works. In other words, I can give to you all day long, but I don't know how to receive from you. Blocked intimacy. Desertion. If you just find yourself where it seems like everyone just deserts you, whether it may be emotionally or physically, that's a big one. Divorce. If you see divorce a lot in your family line, it could be an abandonment wound. Emotional abandonment. This one is harder because physical abandonment, you can see someone left you. But emotional abandonment, sometimes we make those excuses, but they were present. That's what I'll have people tell me in those sessions. Marissa, they were present. My dad was there. I mean, he bought me the best gifts. He laughed at my jokes. He was there. Okay, but was he watching TV while you were telling him about your day? Yeah. Did you feel like he actually repeated back and heard what you said to him? No. There's emotional abandonment, right? Because their emotions, they weren't seen or heard for what they were trying to make dad feel. They were only seen and heard physically in what they were saying. Does that make sense? So it's tricky because sometimes we like to have these classic case scenarios. Isolation. Are you someone who loves to be isolated? Do you just need your alone time all the time? Sometimes that can mean we're an introvert. But you know what I found after I got healing? Well, let's just put it this way. In sixth grade and in ninth grade, I took a test, the Myers-Briggs personality test, and I got that I was very introverted and very judging. I don't remember the other ones. I just remember those two because they changed. In my 30s, I got healing from abandonment, unworthiness, and rejection. I retook the test, and guess what? I found out that I'm actually an extrovert to the max, and that I am actually sensing to the max instead of judging. Why? Because abandonment changed my personality, because the spirit of abandonment was oppressing me to not be who God had called me to be. Then you have neglect, loneliness. Do you have that deep sense of loneliness? Can you be in a room full of hundreds of people, even with your closest friends, and still feel lonely? If you feel that way a lot, you may want to look at the spirit of abandonment. Neglect. Neglect may not be some big need. It may not be that your parents didn't feed you when you were little. It may not be that they just, didn't give you these needs. It could have been that you were poor. You may not have been poor on purpose, but it could have just been something that happened. And because of that, you can't help it. Your parents can't help it. Maybe they're trying to get a job. Maybe they're trying their best to do everything they can. Maybe there's a generational curse of abandonment, though, that's causing that poverty to make you feel neglected. It may not even be that. Maybe you feel neglected emotionally. Maybe you just feel like everyone ignores you. Maybe you feel like every time you talk, people just talk over you. That's neglect. Because we all have these needs, and I'm going to talk about them in just a minute under neglect. But not wanted. Have you ever had that sense of feeling not wanted? Rejection. I feel rejected. Or I have self-pity. I was really good at throwing pity parties for myself. I could walk out of a room and be like, "Oh, you didn't deserve to be treated like that. Oh, I'm like Eeyore. Everybody hates me. Guess I'll go eat worms." And I was like that, and people didn't want to be around me. I laugh about it now, but in reality, it was so devastating then. I probably went home and cried every time I was around people. Well, I didn't probably. I know that I did most of the time. Why? Because I felt so abandoned. But what happened is the spirit of abandonment was so on me that I was experiencing all of those things plus feeling not wanted. Rejection. That's pretty self-explanatory. Separation, that can mean being separated from your parents for a short amount of time. It can be separation when it comes to law things, like you can have times of separation in your marriage. You can have times of separation from your family. It just may be that you feel you're separated at all times. Like maybe your husband has a job where he has to constantly be separated from you. It doesn't have to be legal separation in marriage, but it can be in lots of areas. Unprotected. This is a big one. We don't like to talk about this one. Why? Because most of our things that are going to have to do with restoring the foundations are all these beautiful brick walls that we've built around our heart of self-protection. And this was me. I'd be like, hey, Miss Joanne, how are you? That's what my insides would be saying. This is what my outsides would be saying. Hey, Miss Joanne, how are you today? And Miss Joanne's probably like, does she hate me? And I'm inside going, I was just so excited. Why did she not understand that I was so excited inside? Because I had built all these beautiful brick walls and painted them up to look like they had a door and flowers and a nice little top on them to be my nice little house. God didn't reside in there. I did. I protected myself. But abandonment is the number one cause of self-protection. So if you have these things, that prayer that I kind of gave you kind of goes over healing for that. So please don't feel devastated that it's not going to work. So signs of the spirit of abandonment, we've already talked about this, so I'm going to go on. Rejection can feel a lot like abandonment. And we're not going through a bunch of things like we just did. I'm just going through the definition of these next three and then the signs of the spirit of them. Because generally, if you have abandonment, if you'll notice, rejection and neglect were underneath abandonment. So sometimes they can be the little bitty demon that's answering to abandonment, and sometimes they can be the primary open door instead of the associated open door. Oh, okay. So what is rejection? It's the act of throwing away, refusal to accept or grant, feelings of unworthiness. I have no value. I'm useless. I feel not good enough. My needs are not important. Oh, I can be a real big perfectionist. Now, why do you think that's on there? Because when we're rejected, we have to be our best. You're talking to the best performer in the world. I could go into any job and do any job they wanted me to do and do it really well. You know what the problem was that with? I was so empty and I wore myself out so much that I was so sick and I had stomach issues because I couldn't gain weight and I had all these issues. Why? I was performing and performing because I felt so rejected. If you're that person who can't just rest, you can't just be you and go, that while I'm sitting here not talking, just in my quiet time, God loves me for Marissa. Oh, while I'm doing all these things, God loves me just like He loved me when I was sitting down doing nothing. That was like punishment for me to sit down and do nothing. I was literally like, I'm going crazy. I got to get up and do something. Like, God, I got to do something for you. I got to read your word. And then I'd read His word. And then I'd be like, well, that's not enough. Now I got to dig into the roots of these words and find out what they mean. And my quiet time has to be an hour. Otherwise, God doesn't love me and doesn't know me because I'm not trying hard enough. But that's what comes out of rejection, perfectionism. It has to be perfect because if it's not, then no one's going to love me. They're not going to tell me, good job, Marissa. Instead, everybody's going to go, I don't want them to do that again. I don't want her to come do a graphic design again because guess what? She really did a bad job on that one. And that's what happens. We become performers and we become perfectionists. Feelings of performing, or even maybe you don't feel like you're a performer, but maybe you just follow the rules. You ever met that person who you can't do anything but the exact rules of what's written down? Maybe there's a rule that's not written down, but it's just self-explanatory and it's common sense, but they won't even do that because it's not on paper. And Hannah's actually smiling at me because she's a big rule follower, but I used to be this way. And it was the point of like, you'd give me rules and then it would be like, let's just say that Brett gave me this list of rules that he wanted me to live by today and do in the house. If those rules were on there, I would do exactly what those things said. But in the process, let's just say he said, you know what, Marissa, I would really like for you to pick up the shoes and put them nicely on the rack. Okay, I'll do that. And I do that, but then let's just say there's these other things over here that need to be organized and cleaned, just like the shoes. I'm not going to touch those because those weren't on the rules. That's a better benefit of it, but sometimes it's a worse benefit because that's the type of people that you want to lead your organization, but you know can't because you know they have such integrity that they're going to follow the rules, but now you're getting 700 text messages to explain a simple task because if the rule's not written, they're not going to do it. And you're like, this person is driving me crazy. So that's part of rejection. The spirit of rejection. This one only has 4 little guys underneath it, so you don't have a lot to learn. But it's expected rejection. It means I walk into the room and I already expect everyone in here to reject me. Indirect rejection, it may be that I reject others because I know people are going to reject me, or I know that people are. It's like in the South, they have this phrase. It's called bless your heart. And bless your heart may mean, you know what, I hope you're having a really good day. Bless your heart. I'm just praying the Lord bless your heart, right? It may mean I really want to bless them. But bless your heart could also mean, man, they just said that mean thing about me. Bless their heart. Really what that means is I'm speaking curses about you in the word bless your heart, but really you don't know it, right? But that is indirect rejection. You're just constantly getting that passive aggressive, indirect rejection. Perceived rejection. Do you know that people can actually feel they are rejected all the time and they are never rejected? That's what perceived rejection is. I promise I wasn't rejecting you. I was just trying to do something and this is what I had to do to get this done. I really promise, but they feel rejected. Self-rejection. So self-rejection is basically like everybody else I receive and accept, but I reject myself. And these are the last two, and they're kind of quick. Neglect. It's the silent spirit that does so much damage. What do I mean by that? In sessions with RTF or Restoring the Foundation sessions, no one ever thinks this spirit is actually the root spirit. And when we suggest it, usually what people do is, I wasn't neglected. I don't know what you're talking about. That's why it's the silent spirit. But neglect is the fail to care for properly, to give little attention or respect to leave undone or unattended, failure to provide adequate food, clothing, shelter, medical treatment, or supervision. As children, we need these 3 things from our parents and others around us: affirmation, attention, and affection. I don't know if you're like me, but if you look at those things, I can think of where my mom or my dad failed in those in several places. If I can think about that with my parents, think about how many other people in here, think about how much you guys have failed me, right? I'm just kidding. You don't know me that well. But I mean, think about it. If my parents have failed me and they're the ones who're supposed to protect me that much and they love me they would give their life for me, then how many people have been neglected? All of us. At some point, Jesus is the only one who can meet every one of our needs. He doesn't neglect us, but we can feel neglected. So the spirit of neglect can look like these things: conditional love, lack of affirmation, lack of communication, lack of encouragement, lack of guidance, lack of intimacy, lack of love, lack of nurture, lack of protection, lack of security. There's a lot of lack on there, right? So if you feel like I have a lot of lack in my life, you may want to look at this ugly guy and go, it's time for you to get out today. This is the last one: unworthiness. The other one was silent, but this one is so often not thought about, but it's tied to abandonment and rejection. Because if I'm abandoned and rejected so much, how do I have any worth or value anymore? I don't. I feel like I don't anyways. Unworthiness is lacking in excellence or value, poor, worthless, lacking merit, not deserving respect, acceptance, admiration, or support. Unworthiness makes it hard to receive ministry from others as you feel most like your issues are your fault or you're not worthy of God's love. So, what's the main thing with the spirit of unworthiness? If you can give ministry all day long, but you can't receive ministry from anybody, I need you to start looking at this spirit in your life generationally. Because this was me too, 100%. I would just be like, I don't deserve that. I don't deserve them to spend their time with me, but I would spend time all day long with other people, giving them ministry. I didn't know how to receive it. It's inadequacy, inferiority, self-accusation, self-condemnation, self-consciousness, self-hate, self-punishment, self-sabotage, and lack. That's a lot of things, right? And I know I went about 8 minutes over what I wanted to for the teaching part. But the reason why I tied these all together is because sometimes when we kick out one of them out of our lives, or we generationally pray that one, we call it null and void because we generationally break that curse, doesn't mean that sometimes we can't miss one. So a lot of times when you see abandonment, people will miss those other little guys like rejection, neglect, or unworthiness. So you received a handout that has a prayer on there. And I can even possibly post this online under the Facebook in the comments for those who were online. But I'd like to do a little bit of ministry off of Facebook as we kind of go through this prayer together, if that's okay. Yes, there is.